Welcome to our webinar this morning on the transatlantic collaboration on EV batteries and their role in the green energy transition. This event is organized by the European American Chamber of Commerce with the support of the Slovak Embassy in DC. My name is Yvonne Bendinger-Rothschild. I'm the Executive Director of the European American Chamber of Commerce, and I will host you for today's event. I will hand over to get us started to our guest of honor for this program, the Slovak Ambassador, Radovan Javorčík. He's based in DC. Mr. Ambassador, do you want to get us started?
Good morning from sunny Washington, DC. Thank you, Yvonne, and thanks to European American Chamber of Commerce for having us once again, and obviously everybody from my embassy who made it possible, and all the participants of this webinar. Many people think that electromobility is something which is too far away, but it is not, and it's a strategically important thing for transformation of our societies, our behaviors. And there are on both sides of the Atlantic innovative new companies, and not only Tesla and others, which we should not name all the companies in the world, but there are many companies who are involved in a strategic shift in our own movement around continents. But just to give you one flavor, how even if it's close, how far it is. If you look into the fleets, the car fleets of the embassies, you would not see too many of electric cars, not yet. But it will come, and we should lead by example of setting not just the trends by talk, but also by walk and driving hybrid and electric cars as well. It will not be easy for many of us to change our behavior, but looking into how important it is to secure the supply chain for the manufacturing, for my Slovak industry, not mine, but the Slovak industry, to change from internal combustion engines and production line of 1.2 million cars into many more cars which will be usable in 10, 15 years. That's very important. And it's not about just assembly lines, but it's also the supplying of batteries, the raw materials for that. And I'm just eager to hear from everybody in the panel where we can go, what are the technologies at hand, and what sort of collaboration there should be between Europeans and North Americans. So thank you again, Yvonne, and everybody in the panel. I will give it back to you and listen attentively what we can take as lessons learned from both sides of the Atlantic. Thank you, and welcome to the webinar again.
Thank you, Ambassador. So the availability of affordable and flexible battery development, storage, and the recycling is a major factor in our move towards clean energy around the world. And what we wanted to highlight with this program is really how Europe and the US and Canada are collaborating on this important step, getting us to greener energy and greener resources for our energy needs. And we have put together a panel that I'm particularly proud of. I mean, it's like major players in this sector from the US, Canada, and Europe. I will start with Irina Filipova. She's the CEO of Electra. Irina has 20 years of experience in the energy sector, and both as a strategic and operational leader. And her work included senior strategy and operational roles at BP, upstream and downstream. And among them, she was working on an $8 billion investment in the joint venture with TNK on Beyond Petroleum brand and the brand launch of Beyond Petroleum. We have our moderator today. He's the Gareth Hagan. He's the CEO of OCO Global. And in his role, he defined strategy for the firm's client, among them major global trade and investment promotion agencies. Gareth advises the companies on international growth and expansion strategy. Prior to OCO Global, he was at the Boston Consulting Group in London, where he held assignments across strategy, operation, and large-scale change programs, both with the public and the private sector. I'm very happy to see an old friend, Otto Pisson. He used to be at Sario and as such worked with the EACC. He's now on the board of directors at advisory, a project manager for Innobat Auto. And he has over 6 years of experience from the Slovak Governmental Investment Promotion Agency. And there at an organization called Sario, he attracted multiple multi-million investment projects. And he has, with that, hands-on insights on what's required for major companies to successfully start operation overseas. I'm also specifically happy having Dr. Karim Sagib with us. He's a strategic advisor at Investment Quebec and a world-renowned scientist who specializes in energy storage and the electrification of transportation. His team most recently advanced paving the way for the next generation of electric vehicle batteries, and in Quebec is well positioned to play a leading role in that. He will explain exactly why that is the case. Quebec is really on the forefront on the entire battery value chain. And but with that, I hand over to Gareth, who is moderating the conversation today. Gareth, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Yvonne, and welcome everybody to the discussion, basically. And look, it's fair to say that we all know, I think, pretty well, kind of when we look back at this last couple of years, kind of what one of the abiding memories will be. But I promise you that it's the last reference that I'll make directly to the C word on this panel. And the reason that I say that is I don't think that's the only thing that we'll look back on in terms of this decade in years to come, basically, because I actually think that we're undergoing a fairly significant period of change in terms of industry disruption and industry acceleration. And as Yvonne mentioned, as someone who's fortunate to sit in the middle of that in terms of kind of public and private sector, kind of in the last couple of years, I do feel that we're sort of in a period of profound change in the world and change in industry in terms of creating sustainable and green solutions as we look forward. And look, what more relevant to talk about in that context than kind of, the EV and kind of battery industry, which, at least in the mind of the consumer, basically sits very central to that agenda that I've just mentioned. And even more so, I think, when we think about COP26, and I know basically both sides of the pond, basically, the memories and the takeaways from those 2 weeks in Glasgow are still very, very fresh in the mind. So look, what better time then to be having this panel discussion as we kind of sit at this very interesting kind of point in history around EVs and that. And look, I'm very fortunate today to be joined by really an esteemed panel who kind of sit across the whole of this value chain that I'm looking forward to talking about in the next sort of 3/4 of an hour, basically. So look, with no further ado, basically, and I'm kind of the least interesting voice you're going to hear from today, I'd like to sort of step into the panel, and Yvonne has very kindly introduced everybody. So I think with that, basically, we'll just step straight in. So look, I suppose just to maybe orientate people, I think what we'll try and do in the next sort of 35-40 minutes is maybe take 3 topics. So first of all, we'll start, and I'd like to hear the thoughts from the panel around the development of the industry so far. So kind of bring us up to speed, I guess, with kind of current development and current thinking around the whole value chain that sits around EV. I suppose secondly, the challenge, and to my earlier point, is often thrown about how do we scale, how do we accelerate this industry. Clearly, that's a kind of a hot topic at the moment, and we can start to talk a little bit about that as well. And what I'd like to do with the panel is finish up maybe with a little bit of a rallying call or a challenge, to my point around sort of sitting at a moment in time in this industry. I'd love to hear from the panelists around basically the key challenges and your sort of pleas or your basically wishes in terms of how we address and how we kind of resolve those as we move forward. So if we can do that in the next 35-40 minutes, I think we'll all make for a very, very interesting discussion. So look, Karim, I'd like to begin with you actually. And for some of us, we might think of this as an industry that has really only sort of taken shape in the last decade. But of course, that would be entirely the wrong conclusion to draw. And I know that you're a gentleman who's worked in this for much, much longer than that, basically in Quebec and in other parts of the world. So I'd love basically to hear kind of your own thoughts, Karim, and sort of to get the party started, as it were, just in terms of your perspectives around the development of the industry so far in Quebec and more broadly, and where you basically believe that the industry has evolved to today.
Yes, thank you. Anyway, thank you very much for the kind invitations. Yes. So if just I make a short, and I have been to this business on lithium batterification for 35 years. So if you see, the first lithium-ion battery was invented by Sony in Japan, and last 25 years, all the lithium-ion for electrification was dominated by Asian, like Korea, Japan, and Chinese. And if you see today, the top 10 company in the world who is producing a battery for EV worldwide, and the top of 10 are Asians, and the number one was CATL, number two is Panasonic, Samsung, LG, and also BYD, and so on. And behind that, you can see about the science, and also regarding the invention of the technology was born between North American and Europeans. But all the chain supply was between these three countries, China, Korea, and also Japan. So what we was doing here, if you come to see here what we are doing here in Quebec and so on, we want to work on very secure chain supply between Quebec, Canada, and USA and European, because as you know, we are very close to USA, very close to Europe. And behind that also, we are building very unique an ecosystem. What means that this ecosystem is from the mining to recycling. Because we have all critical minerals. Today, the domination of lithium battery today is lithium-ion batteries. Why we call it lithium-ion battery? Because the state of lithium in anode, cathode, and electrolyte is lithium-ion. So for anode, we need mineral like coppers, graphite, silicon. Anode, we need electrolyte, we need lithium. And then for cathode, what we need? Nickel, cobalt, manganese, phosphate, iron, and aluminum. And all the minerals are here in Quebec. And Quebec also, we are the large producer of hydroelectricity. So 100% of our energy is very clean and very secure place also to produce and also to make transformation of these minerals. So we like to have this kind of the relationship with North Americans, that at least become that this chain supply from our materials. And also we have the technology. The first patent in lithium-ion battery was part between Quebec and CNS in 1980. And then also, as I said, we have this, when we can about transportation also, we have the deep sea that we can transport the minerals, transform mineral to USA. And also we have like, of course, direct line by the sea from Quebec to Europe. And behind that also we have what we call it free market between Canada, USA, and free market between Canada and Europe. So this is really that what we like to offer right now here. And we have also capital human. We like to have this kind of exchange and so on. So I stop here to, at least I was explaining how the domination of lithium-ion by Asians and how we can work together via consortium, via exchange and cross-licensing, and also especially to bring this ecosystem of Quebec to North America and Europeans.
Very good. Thanks, Karim. And look, you mentioned a lot there. I mean, one of the words that sort of stuck with me was you mentioned the ecosystem. And of course, the ecosystem, basically is broad. As you mentioned, it spans supply of raw materials, it spans, low cost and sustainable energy. But of course, the ecosystem is kind of much broader than that. And Arena, we've all become very familiar in the last sort of, kind of 5 years with the presence of charging stations, which are a pretty key part of the infrastructure in the ecosystem, and something that we didn't see very much basically, but now are kind of commonplace. And obviously, within your own business in Electrata, you're basically playing a central role about how do we provide consumer solutions and make this ecosystem ultimately work in the long term. So I'd love to hear a little bit about Electrata, your business model, kind of how that's evolved basically, and how you're basically playing that role kind of in the ecosystem moving forward.
Thank you, Gareth. Very happy to speak to those topics. So Electrata, at Electrata, we handle everything that organizations need to power electric vehicles. So what that means is we are really offering a charging as a service solution, a full solution to organizations and individuals ultimately. So we start that process with assessing the use case, with assessing, in the case of a fleet transition, which vehicles the organization is planning to transition to, what they have in mind, what sort of duty cycles they need to respond to. Are these light, medium, heavy-duty vehicles? What kind of business they're in? We evaluate also the sites, the depots, where those vehicles will be parked and effectively charged. And then we go through the process of selecting the right fit electric vehicle charging infrastructure. But we don't stop there, because as a full service provider, we look at the entire scope of energy management, which obviously is different from site to site, from customer to customer, and can range from just a simple installation of level 2 electric vehicle charging, which provide around 7.2 kW, to all the way to DC fast charging and a full microgrid solution with battery storage and solar distributed energy resources on site. So the complexity of our solutions differs significantly. The fleet electrification process is in its infancy, certainly in the United States. And as organizations go through the process of trying to identify how to best transition their vehicles to electric, we're there to help them with a full roadmap exercise of how to make that strategy a reality effectively for their business. Of course, being in the electric vehicle charging business, we sit, if you will, at the very end of that value chain, whereas Karim's organization as at the R&D side of things, but we're seeing basically how the full value chain is being impacted. We know very well now from research, which has been widely publicized, that range anxiety and cost are two major barriers to electric vehicle adoption. And that's true across the board, everywhere in the world. Both of those variables are actually addressed through the battery, through the design of the battery, through the cost of the battery, through its weight, and both range anxiety and cost can be addressed more effectively by designing batteries that better fit the eventual use case for the vehicles. So, and again, we're hearing a lot about major investments from OEMs, from major auto manufacturers in battery research. So the billions of dollars that have been announced of going into EVs, it's not just into the production plants and the conveyor belts, it's into battery research, because we're trying to make the battery smaller, lighter, and yet more powerful at the same time, to put it into layman's terms. So for us, obviously, that whole value chain, the whole transition is really affecting how organizations think about transitioning to electric. Oftentimes, you know, there will be one area where they just don't feel comfortable. For example, you know, range anxiety, not the vehicle not having enough range to complete the duty cycle throughout the day, or the vehicle being too expensive for the organization. So certainly on the infrastructure side, we are the owner and operator of that infrastructure portfolio. So we invest in infrastructure ourselves. So for our customers, their only headache really rests with the vehicle. And for that, we oftentimes bring partners who are either OEMs or fleet management companies that provide leasing to organizations to, again, lower that initial capital requirement. But I think it's also important to understand that as this industry is still in its nascent, native stages of evolution, there's very little education and awareness about how electric vehicles actually work. So that when organizations start thinking about that transition, how to map their existing internal combustion engine fleet to an electric vehicle fleet, they need to understand lots of inputs into what makes an EV an EV. On the cost side, on the maintenance side, on the performance side, and then obviously understanding how that infrastructure will be there supporting them. So I don't think we're going to skip this step. Most organizations have to go through the painful step of really understanding the mapping of vehicles and of the battery to internal combustion engine before they make a major leap into electrification of their fleets, or electrification for their employees, or electrification for their residents or patrons or customers. But that process is underway. There's more and more in the public domain. There are webinars like this that happen almost every week, to where the public is getting educated, and the questions are becoming more pointed. I think we in the industry just have to stay very disciplined about continuing to emphasize the message around the importance of this transition, about the fact that it's eventually going to happen sooner probably rather than later, and all the benefits that come with electric transportation in terms of greenhouse gas reduction, in terms of cleaner air, and obviously greater energy independence for nation states.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Irina. I couldn't agree more. And when you talk about that, I suppose, middle of the ecosystem in terms of the core battery kind of product itself, basically, I can't think of a better introduction to our third kind of panelist in terms of Otto, who's working obviously at Innobat. Otto, and it'd be great to sort of hear your perspective around some of the things that you're doing at Innobat in terms of sort of battery storage performance and some of the other sort of kind of elements that Irina talked about, and how you're sort of helping to shape with partners and with basically other kind of players in the value chain, kind of how you're evolving to meet some of those challenges that Irina has talked about.
Yeah, sure. No, yeah, it will be on spot to introduce Innobat a bit, because I don't assume that everyone knows us. We are a young company. I've been with the company for a year now, which is 50% of its company history. So we're not an established player, but this gives us a lot of flexibility, and this gives us kind of like a lot of room to learn from, let's say, mistakes of different other companies, and probably catch niche segments which these companies cannot serve. So now I'm mostly talking about the major players that have like a catalog type approach towards OEMs, bring a battery, say that this is the battery, this is how it's made, and this is how it can be put in a vehicle, and the OEM then can adjust its structure to adapt this battery. And this really works for some of the battery producers, as really electrification is a huge trend and OEMs have to adapt as well. However, we approach this in a bit different way, as we are trying to make tailor-made batteries for the requirements of our clients. So you can imagine that a family car would need a completely different battery than a performance car. Yeah, one would concentrate more on cycle life and cost. The other, well, probably cost is not that important, and it has to focus on performance. What I also like to mention is that a lot of people tend to think about e-mobility in a way that it's only related to passenger cars. Electrification is happening all across the mobility segment. It's buses, it's last mile delivery, it's aviation. So if we expand this kind of like family car, performance car, kind of like battery attributes, and just elevate it to a bus or aircraft level, then one can see the differences in formats, in chemistries, and how these batteries should be made. So we are really trying to focus on those niche segments which are underserved at the moment, for whom no one makes batteries, as the major players that are now establishing themselves in Europe, as Karin well pointed out, it's mostly a majority of them is Far East Asian. So it's the LG Chems, the CATLs, the SK Innovations, the Samsung SDIs of the world, and they come here to serve the mass-produced Volkswagen ID.3s and these types of cars that are made in 200,000 units per year in a factory. But there are all the other cars, the supercars, performance cars, light commercial vehicles, and all these kind of segments for whom these major East Asian players do not make their production lines, and these are the segments that we would like to catch. And in order to do that, you have to have R&D capacities to be able to make the correct chemistry mixture, correct format, in order to fit the attributes of that specific vehicle or model type. So this is also kind of like reflected in our current capacities, as we currently have one 9,000 square meter R&D slash pilot production line. This is a facility that we are currently reconstructing and will be operational by the end of next year. And then we are planning to scale our production so that we can also meet the economies of scale standards that's required for the clients that we are going to serve. And obviously we have then even bigger plans to make a full-scale gigafactory as its industry standard, but this would be also aiming to serve the specific segments which are underserved at the moment. So this is kind of like my take on e-mobility. It's not just one segment. This means that it's a variety of chemistries. It's a variety of formats. It's a variety of battery types, and it's a very interesting time to be a battery company, because the whole segment is emerging and a lot of mobility fields are trying to electrify, and they're looking for partners.
Yeah, no, thanks, Giotto. And I totally agree, basically, that as the industry broadens and as those niches become less niches, I guess is one way to describe it, that it'll require pretty significant development and collaboration across the industry. Karim, maybe just as we think ahead a little bit around sort of industry development, we'll come back to you and just linked a little bit to your earlier comments around collaboration, US, Canada, Europe. I think it's fair to say that quite a lot of the supply, particularly on the raw materials side, sits outside of that sort of corridor at the moment. In terms of that and just more broadly, I'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts around sort of the cooperation and the initiatives that you're kind of seeing or participating in at the moment, and how you see those evolving as we move forward.
Yeah, what Quebec right now was doing what you call it battery initiatives. And this battery initiative has a budget about 10 billion for the next 5 years. And we want to attract investors and the companies who is going to install their productions. As I said, it's coming from transformation of natural resources, and they can produce anode materials or active cathode materials. And this is anode and cathode materials. It can be like collaborations. Of course, other thing what you are doing here in Quebec is the traceability of these materials. So means that materials is green because it's producing by very clean process, hydroelectricity and so on. And this is for kind of the collaboration between North Americans and European, that material can go to the cells or to the battery in Europe or here in USA. This is, I think, very important. At least you see to see how we can make this kind of component. And behind that also, we are looking also for cell manufacture. We believe that with automatizations, and also we have the proximity of natural sources here in Quebec, that collaboration, of course, many of the OEMs are in USA and also in Europe. And then if you make this kind of the cells and then you export the cell from Quebec here and the module and pack, it can made in Europe and USA through like three-party collaborations, and then you have the access to the minerals, access to the transformations. And they believe Irina, she is right about the cost. The cost is issue. Today, lithium-ion battery, in order that penetration of electric vehicles become higher and higher than internal combustion engines, the cost must be less than $100 a kilowatt hours in the pack. When you have natural sources, you make transformations with low cost energy and low cost process, so you can bring this kind of cost of the cells or the pack very low. So what I am looking on this kind of the consortium between North American and Europeans in order to exchange not only for the technology, the manufacturing process, and how we can get access to these strategical minerals in order that we can be independent from Asians and become like having like own our technology, and as I said, be with green, secure, and also safe chain supply between North American and also European through communications and through this kind of open innovations and open marketing together. And of course, this is, I think, in win-win relationship.
Yeah, no, thanks, Karim. And I guess Otto at Innovact, you're sort of in the center of the sort of the world that Karim describes in terms of transatlantic cooperation in its various forms and some of the initiatives. And look, I guess that that's going to become even more critical as the industry scales, as we look to reduce unit costs, but also outside of the core battery product, as we think about recycling, as we think about common standards, as we think about sort of other kind of elements as well. Just given, Otto, that Innobat are kind of a good example of a firm in the middle of this, I'd just love to hear your thoughts about time in terms of how you're thinking through some of these challenges, and maybe even a couple of examples, Otto, in terms of things that you're working on that are relevant to this debate as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, definitely. If you look at the European market, if I'm not mistaken, the whole demand for mobility-related battery storage is going to rise 17-fold in this decade, which is a huge capacities will be required to fill this demand. Also, if you look at all the OEMs, I think so. It's probably on the market. There are currently 70 models of battery electric vehicles across the range of all the vehicles I was mentioning, and this is supposed to rise to 180 in 2025. And if you include all the plug-in hybrids and fuel cell vehicles, in 2025 there should be around 330 models on the roads expected to be electrified. So yes, I completely underline the fact that OEMs are going in this direction. It's a trend in Europe. How one can react to it, and this is actually something that we were experimenting with, is this licensing. So, let's say there are different markets. Let's say whatever the US market or some Asian markets, and there are players across the board who are good in one or the other stuff. So let's say in the US, we could probably find a partner who has the manufacturing capability and the local market knowledge, but let's say doesn't have our knowledge of the cell chemistry and the manufacturing process. So we can obviously collaborate together with on a licensing kind of way where we would share this knowledge with them, and then could market Inobat / whatever brackets US name company batteries on the North American market. And then the similar thing could work vice versa. Generally, it's important to produce always the batteries locally. Let's say in Europe, we have these rules of origin kind of thing, which is important for all the customs procedures. So in case the batteries are of non-European content, then and also the other parts of the car would be non-European, then the car maker would have to pay an extra 10% custom duty in order to sell the vehicle in Europe. So in this way, American companies shipping batteries to Europe probably won't be happening. This is why also the Asian competitors are coming to Europe, because this is the only way it can happen. And this is a similar thing of how we could be producing batteries in China or India or the US or wherever, is only through these licensing agreements where the batteries are produced locally. And also from a logistics perspective, it just doesn't make sense to ship batteries across the world on ships. So this is how I see collaboration. So someone who has R&D capacity, someone who knows how to mass produce such batteries, then he can share this knowledge, of course, with a fee with someone who has local manufacturing capacities or financial capacities to build a gigafactory. And this is how probably the global market will be served, and these collaborations will be more and more often. And as everyone knows, or as I mean, probably those who are in the field of batteries know, it's not just the cells, it's the modules, it's the BMSs, it's the battery packs, and it's the whole integration part. So there are a lot of layers where one can cooperate and one can use the other as a supplier-client relationship to get his or her battery or service into an OEM product.
Yeah. And Irina, basically linked to, I mean, I think Otto talked about a scaling of the industry by 20x or possibly even more than 20x in the short term. And we've talked about the sort of challenges that creates around R&D, around scaling production. But of course, it's not just that basically. And often kind of we talk about bottlenecks in the value chain around sort of energy storage, distribution, solutions, accessibility, to make this possible. I mean, just even the thought basically of trying to sort of, kind of replicate a kind of gas station model basically kind of in terms of charging. I mean, what does that look like and how does it actually kind of operate? How does it get funded, etc.? I mean, I know this is the business you're in. I mean, I know that you're working through many sort of, kind of creative and innovative kind of initiatives in this regard, kind of in locations across the US and beyond. Do you want to just talk to us about how you see that evolving? So, if we're painting a picture here of sort of innovation and sort of creativity along the value chain, it doesn't stop when the car leaves the factory. In fact, you might even say it only begins at that point, basically. So it'd be fascinating to hear your thoughts on that, Irina.
Absolutely, Gareth. And really, it is a fascinating dialogue because there's so much information that still is required from the OEMs and even battery manufacturers before the battery gets into the vehicle in terms of capacity, in terms of range, in terms of performance of that vehicle, again, for the specific use cases. And because those vehicles are not yet on the road, we know that they will be. This is certainly our thesis to a lot of our partners to say, be ready to see these 100-some models in the next couple of years. Because they're still not on the road, still not in active use, folks are obviously conservative when they think about EVs and how that transition is going to take place. So Electrata was really brought into life with the purpose of making this transition easier by being that charging as a service provider, full turnkey provider, and taking on all the capital and operational risk in that transition. As we think about the vehicle and how that translates into the operational aspect, not only do we have to match the charging capacity and the duty cycle of that vehicle to the battery, we also have to think through what the future holds in terms of any technology upgrades, in terms of how that park of vehicles is going to evolve over time, because no one is really undertaking electrification at scale. There are lots of announcements, but in reality, that electrification is still, dipping the toe in the water kind of a process, a few vehicles here and there, not a huge, massive transition for obvious reasons. So we urge our clients and customers to really think about road mapping that transition and think about the future and how from 5, 10, 20 vehicles they're going to move to a park of 100, 200, 300 vehicles in their fleet in a very, very short span of time, and what that would mean in terms of electricity consumption at their sites. I'm glad that you mentioned the gas station model. As you know, I come from the oil and gas world, and the EV charging model, in our estimation, is really very, very different, because electric vehicles will be charged where they're parked. And depending on how long they can be parked for, depending on their duty cycle, again, depending on the performance of that vehicle and the route design, some vehicles in the personal use at a residential home or apartment building, they can be parked all night to recharge. Similarly, in the workplace, they can be parked for a great majority of the day if people are working from an office. However, in a lot of other applications, it's a much, much finer tuning of the charging capacity and the need for power for the charging capacity with the vehicle. So what a lot of times we talk to our customers about is really a full-scale energy management, so that they are always ensured that their vehicles are charged. They're charged to capacity that they need to operate, number one. And number two, that the cost of that energy isn't astronomical, that they're not hitting demand charges. In other words, they're not charging their vehicles at the time of peak demand. So we construct a very, very detailed schedule for managing that energy and that capacity at the site, again, depending on the use case and on the specific duty cycle and route design of that vehicle. This is very detailed work. It involves a lot of understanding of how utilities operate, of understanding of how different energy resources can be brought to bear. So if there's storage capacity at the site, either as a contingency to having power being available at the site, or as a way to mitigate cost, that's certainly an avenue that we would take. And similarly with distributed energy resources, using solar, for example, at a site, along with battery storage, to actually make that mobility solution fully clean. That's a huge value proposition to most fleet operators. How can you not only operate electric vehicles, but also ensure that they're powered by clean energy, by renewable energy? So we really aim to make that full journey as easy as possible for our customers, and we worry about all the fine details that sit behind that energy management system. That includes the vehicle, the site, the charging, and all the infrastructure that goes into place at that site. So we like to say that no two sites are created equal, So it really depends on how you approach the whole design of your infrastructure package. In some instances, if a gas station is actually en route for a last mile delivery, for example, truck delivering goods and stopping off to top off at a DC fast charger makes sense, again, from the route design, from the duty cycle of the vehicle. That is not outrageous. That is certainly part and parcel of how that route can be designed. But by and large, we really have to be thinking about infrastructure for electric vehicle charging with a clean slate, with an open mind, with a clean sheet of paper, because it really will depend on availability of power, the duty cycle of that vehicle, and the design of that route. And even I would say facilities and depots and existing buildings are almost secondary to that consideration, because again, as long as power is abundant and available, that vehicle should be able to charge even outside of the existing facility. So this is how we're approaching charging infrastructure and how we are approaching this evolution, again, taking on all of the risk and the cost associated with that transition.
Yeah, and look, Irina, I might stay with you actually just as we move into sort of maybe the plea from the panel, or the plea to the panel, basically. So look, as you talk, I'm just struck by the necessity of the public and private sector working together on some of the challenges you mentioned. I mean, it sort of gets to the heart of this in terms of infrastructure, in terms of planning, in terms of sort of what our cities look like in the future. I mean, it's got written large over everything you've said, basically. If I could maybe, just sort of, ask the sort of the blunt question, if I may, basically, has the penny dropped in terms of this kind of sort of topic? I mean, do you feel as you engage kind of across your clients and across sort of the country, basically, that the penny's dropped? And I guess if it has, or even if it hasn't, basically, what are the sacred cows we got to tackle in order basically to make this workable? So if Kareem can kind of get the raw materials, if Otto can make the best kind of performing batteries in the world, basically, how do we actually make this a workable and sort of sustainable sort of ecosystem moving forward?
Well, thanks for that question, Gareth. Whether the penny has dropped, I think the answer is yes and no. It depends on who you talk to. Unfortunately, there's not a consistent picture on that. I would say that, certainly the genesis of our business comes from the fact that there's a lot of change that's required. That's behavioral change, and it's also mindset change. So a lot of the early initiatives, certainly in the US, related to charging infrastructure development, had the very best intentions that sometimes ended up in unwanted, undesired consequences. And that is because a lot of the early EV charging infrastructure was deployed through incentives and grants, and oftentimes those incentives and grants weren't very specific. So a municipality, a city would receive a grant to install EV charging infrastructure. They'd go out and they source it from a third-party provider without any service level agreements, without any assurance around performance or uptime. Oftentimes that equipment wouldn't even be networked. So if anything went wrong, the host didn't know how to fix it, right? Because the equipment wouldn't be necessarily talking or providing any information to them. And so as a result, there are a lot of sites right now in the US where what we call a deadhead equipment is sitting right now, which of course causes a lot of consternation and frustration for EV drivers, and especially for the organizations. So as we come into this new era with the infrastructure bill, obviously looming large in the US, what we plead oftentimes with our public and private sector partners is to say, be thinking about how to stimulate the market in participating in performance-backed and risk or de-risked rather offering, rather than just focusing on equipment and rather than just focusing on the number of charging points on the map. When you're spending down a budget to simply install EV charging, it's not a very rational way of doing that. You're not necessarily looking at the return on that investment. You're not necessarily evaluating every site and every use case as you should. As an investor in EV charging infrastructure, we do that. We apply very, very detailed analysis to every single deployment that we undertake. And we would deploy only in cases where it makes business sense for our customer and for ourselves. So that eventually will get there, I believe. We're seeing more and more of the grant incentives and requests for proposals focusing on the longevity of the network, the chargers being networked themselves, having warranties, having performance backing, but it's still not at that level where you're really seeing this as a one-for-one investment. There's still public perception that perhaps EV charging should be free, which of course, again, is a very slippery slope, because if you're making something free, you're immediately signaling to the market that there is no value in what is being provided. So we believe that you need to have that performance conversation on the network from the very start, before a single dollar gets spent on that deployment. You need to talk about your use case. You need to put the right amount of charging for the right amount of vehicles. We're talking to a lot of cities that are putting in a charger per vehicle, and they know that it's not necessarily the right ratio. However, it's an easy ratio, and it's something that their budgets allow, so they continue on that same path, even though they themselves know this is not the right approach. And it's over investing really in charging infrastructure instead of investing smartly in it. You know, there's more and more, I think, also of a tendency to start thinking about this infrastructure as part of the overall smart city development. So connecting electric mobility with other initiatives in terms of overall transportation development, overall network development, putting it into urban planning strategies early on is really, really important. And the same goes for real estate development, facilities development, any kind of new builds that may be underway. So again, our thinking is design thinking. Think through to the end first before you jump on and start spending dollars on easy EV charging infrastructure, because you're going to have buyer's remorse at some point, not having it all the way through, thought all the way through, and not having thought all the way through the conversion of your fleet and the speed at which that is going to happen.
Got it. No, thanks, Serena. And Otto, if I can ask you a similar question. I mean, I'm in the UK at the moment, and I remember listening to a debate. I think it was the night of the COP sort of finished here in Glasgow, and the argument was that, you know, the private sector, you know, has kind of to my penny dropped sort of point. Basically, you know, the penny had dropped, but perhaps it hadn't quite dropped with government, or not to the extent basically where it met with their basically sort of objectives around sort of net zero and stuff, whatever. Look, I know that you've been involved in various programs basically around kind of government sort of stimulus or support, but I suppose my question to you, Otto, is, you know, what more and what could and what should be done, you know, basically to kind of, you know, drive the transition and to drive this kind of critical change that we've all been talking about?
Okay, no, sure. I mean, how to put it? So I'm all for safeguarding the fair trade principles here in the EU regarding state aid and not distorting the market with incentives. This is you know, a key that's very heavily regulated in the EU. But e-mobility reaches outside the EU, and there are a lot of Far East Asian players who come into our markets, and definitely they work in different standards than we are used to here in Europe. With here I mean that they are more heavily supported by the governments. They work with different standards than we do. So actually, you know, it's our kind of like idea that these major topics such as e-mobility, they have to be well funded with also the public interest, keeping the public interest in mind. And I think that it was well approached here in the EU. So there is this IPCEI fund. This is the Important Projects of Common European Interest. This is actually the response mechanism of the EU to, you know, try to facilitate major projects more quickly than it's used to. So here we also, as you know, got a huge validation being accepted in this program, and the EU is going to be supporting our R&D costs for making the batteries happen, and we have our roadmap up till solid state and so on. So this is something that we are very happy for. Also, there is the Recovery and Resilience Fund. That's a reaction to the C-word type of crisis that you were mentioning, and we are not mentioning this word. But yeah, it has very strongly struck the whole supply chain and everything related to that, and how the economy is reacting. So what everyone here in Europe knows, that Europe can be globally competitive if it manages just to recover from the current crisis quickly, and if it manages to recover in a way that's greener than it was before. So this is how all these investments will need to be made sustainable, and this the Recovery and Resilience Fund and IPCEI, and also in combination with all the national budgets that are there to support the green transition, they're very interesting for players in this field. I'll just name a few initiatives within Europe, how several countries approach this. So really, Spain is a forerunner from the recovery plan. They are going to spend 4.3 billion on the battery supply chain, and it's the entire supply chain from mining to production of cars. So they also have a strong presence of SAT, which is Volkswagen Group, and generally Volkswagen is aiming to build these gigafactories. So probably there is some match to it. Also, Italy will be spending €1 billion on battery, solar, and wind energy. Also, the UK, from what I understand, there is this transformation. There is this huge budget for the transformation of the automotive industry, and also this UK BIC, that's publicly funded, like battery research center that was put up in the UK. These are all initiatives that are there to support this industry, and it's extremely important. Because if it's not there, then we might find ourselves being, the facilitators of e-mobility and a huge market for electric vehicles, but they will run not on European technologies and not on European batteries, produced here, but controlled a bit by different players, and to a certain level that it becomes strategic. So this is why it's important to support both, but keep in mind Europe or continental interests, and this is why public funding is important.
No, thanks, Otto. And maybe just my final question, Kareem. Maybe I'll bring it back to where we started with yourself, basically. And we talked about this critical juncture that we face in the industry. Arena, talked about how do we bring sort of investor type principles to the investments that we make. Otto's talked just now about kind of the stimulus and some of the support that might be helpful, basically at this period. Just as you sort of reflect, I suppose, on your long association with this industry and where it's gotten to, Kareem, what in your mind are sort of some of the interventions or some of the priorities that are really going to be required, basically to sort of scale and to meet some of the broader objectives that we've set ourselves for the next decade?
Yes, I think, as I said, our objective was say from the mineral to active cathode materials and cathode material and other materials. And behind that, I believe when we spoke about this kind of collaboration, this kind of investment, Quebec also is provider of the technology. Maybe few in the world, they know that lithium-ion battery iron phosphate was born in Quebec. So today, Tesla, CATL, all these guys are using this technology. Behind that, I think we have no chance today to speak about beyond lithium-ion, like solid-state battery also. Same thing, the lithium solid-state battery also is born here in Quebec. And we have today only one European company, Bolloré Blue Solution, who producing this technology for Mercedes-Benz and so on. So this kind of not only provider of natural sources, the technology, and I already spoke about ecosystem. So I think collaboration with investors, and Gareth, you spoke about this kind of consortium between the private and government. This is another key also that we can accelerate this kind of collaboration. Not can be on the countries, but can be between North Americans and Europeans. And they said, I think Otto spoke about cross licensing, cross technology, manufacturing, this kind of industry 4 and so on. So this kind of investment, not only the money, but if you are not provider of the technology, you have not natural resources, you have this not network of charging station and so on. So you cannot really go to the best acceleration of electric vehicles. So we need to have this kind of visions for more collaborations, as I said before, investors, technology provider, natural sources. And they said our focus right now in Quebec is mainly to attract these investors or company or OEMs in order that they can manufacture at least the component for battery and so on.
Good. No, thank you, Kareem. Well, look, guys, we've got a couple of questions from the audience. Actually, we've got about 5 minutes left, and there's a number of questions, but I'm just going to pick out 2 if I can in terms of themes. Basically, there's certainly some conversation, I guess, on the chat bar around the topic of recycling, and obviously, with many of these batteries and the sort of the components that are within them, basically recycling is a hot topic. Some kind of thoughts from the audience around sort of disappointing results around kind of recycling up to this point, but also kind of a question around sort of what are some of the opportunities or what need to be done to kind of make more recycling kind of more effective in the future. Maybe just some thoughts from the panel. Kareem, I see that you're nodding your head, basically, but thoughts around recycling would be great, and Otto from yourself as well.
I believe recycling is very important. This is, we call it urban mine versus natural mine. We need to have the balance between natural mine, because we have limitation in future for lithium, for also nickel, cobalt, and so on. We're going to speak about 2025, 2030 about terawatt hours. And when we speak about terawatt hours, we need millions of tons of nickel, cobalt, manganese, and lithium, and so on. So recycling becomes very important. But before recycling, let's see, if you are using iron phosphate technology, lithium ion today, we have 15,000 cycles. We have millions of miles. And if you are using NMC, you're going to have also like 1 million miles. Before recycling, we're going to see the second life of the battery. And second life, it can be for energy storage, it can be for large megawatt hours or home energy storage and so on. And then we're going to recycling. In order to recycle, we need to think about over 95% of the battery for recycling. What means we need to use a very deep technology like hydrometallurgy and so on, and also to make this kind of electrochemistry method and so on, and recycling will become very important. We need legislations from government. We need also, like strong commitment also from company, for EM, to see how making this policy to recycle. And I believe in future on the battery over maybe 2030 and so on, we need at least to see the content of materials, at least 50% in battery as the recycler and 50% for the mine. And we need to have the balance in future between urban mine and natural mine.
Yeah. And Otto, your thoughts as well?
Yeah, very quickly. So exactly the same thing as Karim was mentioning. It's very hard to open a lithium mine in Europe or a cobalt mine or whatever mine because of the environmental impact. And in the future, we'll need a lot of lithium. So recycling the batteries makes sense. Why maybe some people are disappointed at the moment, it's the scale. So there are not too many spent batteries on the market. So making a large scale recycling facility doesn't make sense capex wise, because you just don't get enough feedstock to produce the chemicals at the end. In the recycling process is there's like 2 steps to it. I mean, the one is the mechanical part where you shred, where you separate, like you separate the battery parts manually, then you throw in the cells into a shredder, and then you have several separation mechanisms where the foils, the metals and everything comes out, and then you have something called the black mass. And this is something that you can sell already to some producers who can then make the active materials out of it. The ideal recycling, the one where you yourself can separate the separate lithiums, cobalts, nickels, manganese out of the recycling processes. So what Karim mentioned, the hydromet and pyrometallurgical processes and so on. And these capex wise are investments in tens, if not 100 million euros of a scale of a normal production facility. So there is not enough feedstock at the moment for these batteries, but obviously with the rising trends in e-mobility and the guarantees that OEMs are now putting on their electric vehicles, which is, I don't know, 8 to 10 years, depends, then we'll be getting these batteries from the market. Yes, there is also the option of doing a second life thing, but if not, then they can, I mean, the technology is there and we know how to do it. We actually have another vertical called Innovative Recycling that is going to do exactly this. And apart from that, they're going to recycle our battery scrap from production, because those who know how batteries are made know that there is some scrap from it, which happens at the notching and the degassing part, where you have to slit off the part of the pouch. So we are calculating with this, and we want to be a part of the European recycling chain, because it's going to be needed, and it's a great business opportunity.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Otto. Look, I'm just going to finish very quickly, Irina, with a question to you, and then we'll hand back to Yvonne, basically. So, look, we talked about, I guess, sustainability and sort of scalability in terms of recycling. I mean, back to sort of, you know, the part of the value chain with which you're most familiar. A question from the audience around, you know, as technology and chemistry sort of evolves, basically, as we move forward, are the sort of the charging solutions at the last mile or the last kind of, you know, stretch of the value chain? Are they basically technology agnostic or technology neutral, that you know, we actually build scale basically at the charging end as well?
Absolutely, a very, very important question. No one wants to end up with stranded assets, and least of all the investor in those assets. So we build in technology agnosticity into our design, into our pipeline. We also build in upgrading on behalf of the hosts as technology evolves. But the important thing to remember here is that this is a new industry, and the standards in this industry are only evolving now. And so creating an industry standard that would ensure that the charging infrastructure that's being manufactured actually matches the capacity of the batteries that are being manufactured. Currently, the charging infrastructure is a little bit ahead. So most of the vehicles on the road come under in terms of their ability to absorb the charging, but it will change rather quickly, especially with scale. So making sure that the industry standards are followed, and we have a very rigorous process for selecting industry players by virtue of what they manufacture. I think that is going to be a great help and bring everyone on the same page.
Great, great. Well, listen, I just want to say a big thanks to all of the panelists. Basically, I think it's been a fascinating discussion. Basically, I don't think an hour sort of quite does it justice in terms of dissecting the global value chain in such an important, basically, kind of industry. But I think you did an excellent job, basically, and you really enlightened us over the hour. So a big thank you to all of you for that. And with that, Yvonne, I'll pass back over to you to close.
Thank you so much. Really, really interesting conversation. But I agree with you, Garrett. We need to continue this, because we really, like Otto and Irina just said, just in the beginning and scratching the surface on this. But batteries is the name of the game. If we don't solve the battery issue, we will never, you know, have a meaningful, you know, move ahead or a big step that we need to take for the green energy transition. And thank you to our panel for taking the time to join us and share your thoughts on this. Very, very interesting. And we will get back to you for round 2 and see, you know, how this continues in the near future. And this was actually our last virtual event for 2021. Obviously, we're planning more webinars for 2020, and we will be announcing them on the EACC website shortly. In the meantime, I would like to invite our New York audience to a live event on, it's our annual real estate update, and which obviously has to be held in person. We're talking about real estate, so we're going to host it in real estate and live. As always, we will upload a recording of the seminar on our YouTube channel. The link will be on our website. And thank you again for joining us. If you're a member, we can please reach out to us. We're happy to connect you to some of the attendees of the program and the speakers if you're interested. We have a couple of questions from attendees that I will send directly to the speakers. They're a little bit more detailed on technical issues, and I will send them on. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, Garrett, for moderating.